My name is Linda Holloway. I'm 29 years old, and until last Christmas, I genuinely believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, if I made myself small enough, my family would eventually see me. Christmas is supposed to feel warm. Even when the turkey is dry and someone brings up politics they shouldn't, there's usually something comforting about it. Maybe it's the glow of the lights or the smell of cinnamon and pine that makes everyone pretend just for one night that old grudges don't exist. I used to believe that. I used to believe Christmas was a ceasefire. That illusion shattered the moment my older brother stood up from his chair. But before I get ahead of myself, let me rewind. I live in a quiet part of Oregon and work remotely as a product designer. Nothing flashy, no big titles, no impressive LinkedIn bio that makes relatives brag about me at dinner parties. I've always been the quiet one in the family, the daughter who didn't cause scenes, who went along with plans she didn't make, who brought a book to gatherings, and somehow still ended up being everyone's emotional dumping ground. Too polite to interrupt, too passive to say no, the one everyone assumes will be fine no matter what. My older brother Julian is the opposite. He's 33, loud, charismatic, the kind of man who could charm a room full of strangers and walk out with a business deal. He works in real estate, sort of. He flips properties using a combination of our parents' money connections and an uncanny ability to make people feel like helping him is their idea. Growing up, Julian was the golden child. It was never said out loud, but it didn't need to be. We all felt it. He was the future, the leader, the son who would carry the family name forward. I was just there. For years, I convinced myself I was imagining the favoritism, that I was being dramatic, sensitive. That word followed me my entire life. My younger sister Clara once told me exactly that, after I mentioned how Julian always dominated decisions. You need to be less sensitive, she said, rolling her eyes. So I swallowed it. I still showed up. Every holiday, every birthday, I brought gifts, I helped clean. I covered for Julian when he flaked on commitments, like the time we were supposed to help our dad repaint the garage, and Julian bailed last minute, yet somehow I was the one who got sighed at. If you were more persuasive, my mother said casually, maybe your brother wouldn't blow things off. That one stuck. Looking back now, I can see the cracks forming years before everything collapsed. Passive-aggressive comments from my mother about how not everyone needs a fancy degree. My father congratulating me on promotions, but asking if Julian helped me prepare. Clara slowly pulling away, choosing comfort over loyalty. And yet I kept showing up. The real shift began after our grandmother passed away. She hadn't been gone more than 6 weeks when the assumptions started. Comments, jokes, smiles that lingered too long. Julian's wife mentioned expanding their house once Grandma's place sells. Someone joked about school districts near Grandma's neighborhood. No one asked questions. No one checked documents. It was simply understood the house would be Julian's. Except, I knew something they didn't. I'd been the one visiting Grandma every Sunday after Grandpa died. I helped with groceries, fixed her computer, played cards with her when the house felt too quiet. I was there when she talked about her will, when she told me softly but firmly that she wanted me to have the house because I showed up when no one else did. I never told a soul. So when Christmas came and everyone gathered around my parents' table with forced smiles and overfilled wine glasses, I already felt the tension humming beneath the surface. Julian kept glancing at me with that familiar smug look. His wife was practically vibrating with excitement. Even my mother looked strangely pleased. I didn't understand why until dessert. Julian stood up, tapped his spoon against his wine glass, and cleared his throat. I just want to say he began smiling like a man who believed the world belonged to him. After a lot of conversations, we've come to a family decision. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. We all voted, he continued, and agreed. You're no longer part of this family's future plans. Everyone nodded. That was the moment I realized Christmas was never a ceasefire. It was an execution, and they had no idea what I was about to put on the table. I remember the silence more than the words. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket, but the sharp, stunned quiet that follows a gunshot. The kind where everyone freezes, unsure whether to flinch, laugh, or pretend they didn't just hear what they heard. My fork hovered in the air for a second longer than it should have, then I slowly set it down on the edge of my plate. The metal clink was soft, almost polite, too polite for what had just happened. Across the table, Julian was still standing, smiling, waiting. My mother's lips were pressed together in that familiar way she used whenever something unpleasant but necessary was happening, like firing a contractor or returning an expensive dress. My father stared at the tablecloth as if the pattern suddenly required intense concentration. Clara shifted in her seat, already uncomfortable, already wishing she were anywhere else. No one said my name. That was the strangest part. I think a small, younger version of me, the one who used to bring coloring books to family gatherings and try to stay invisible, expected someone to laugh and say it was a joke, or at least soften it, clarify, explain. Instead, Julian lifted his glass. It's not personal, he said smoothly. It's just alignment. Vision. You know how these things go. I looked around the table, taking them in one by one. The people who had watched me grow up, the people I had covered for, defended, accommodated. You voted, I repeated quietly. My mother nodded. It wasn't easy, Linda. That almost made me laugh. I reached for the back of my chair and lifted my coat, draping it over my arm. Julian's smile widened, satisfied. He thought I was about to leave. About to do what I'd always done, remove myself to make things easier for everyone else. I didn't. Instead, I sat back down. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and placed a thin, worn leather folder on the table between the wine glasses and dessert plates. The sound it made was barely audible, but it changed everything. Conversation died instantly. Even the Christmas music, humming faintly from the speaker in the corner, felt too loud now. Julian frowned, his eyes dropping to the folder like it might bite him. "What's that?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I let the moment stretch just a little, long enough for discomfort to creep in, long enough for the balance of power so carefully maintained for decades to wobble. "Future plans," I said, finally leaning back in my chair. "You all seem very confident about them." Clara sighed, already irritated. "Linda, please don't make this dramatic." "Dramatic?" I tilted my head. "You just voted me out of the family like I'm a bad investment." Julian chuckled, but it came out tight. "Look, you've always kind of done your own thing. You're distant. You barely talk at gatherings. You didn't even help with Grandma's affairs." That one landed, not because it hurt, but because of how wrong it was. I'd stayed quiet after Grandma passed, because I didn't want to be accused of meddling. And now they were using that silence as proof that I didn't care. "Is that what you think?" I asked Clara, meeting her eyes. "That I didn't care?" She looked away. Julian stepped in, eager to reclaim control. "This family builds together, plans together. Grandma wanted her legacy to go to someone who could expand it." "Someone like you?" I asked calmly. He smiled. "Exactly." There it was, the entitlement, the assumption that had never once been questioned. I rested my fingers on the edge of the leather folder. "What if I told you," I said slowly, "that Grandma didn't see it that way?" The shift was immediate. Curiosity replaced smugness. Even my mother leaned forward slightly. I opened the folder. Inside were 2 documents neatly printed. One was the updated will, dated 3 months before Grandma's death. The other was the notarized property deed transfer already filed with the county. I didn't slide them across the table. I didn't need to. Julian's face changed first. Not dramatically, but subtly. A flicker of panic flashed behind his eyes before he tried to mask it with a scoff. "This is fake," he said quickly. "Grandma would never—" "She did," I cut in. "You just weren't there." My mother's wine glass trembled in her hand. My father finally looked up. What is this?" he asked. "I met with Grandma's lawyer 2 weeks before she passed," I said. "She wanted me to have the house, the land, everything." Clara's eyes filled not with sadness, but with realization. She had backed the wrong side. "You didn't even tell us," she whispered. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" I looked at her, really looked. "Would you have listened?" Silence. Julian's voice hardened. "You manipulated her. You took advantage of an old woman." Something cold settled in my chest. "You weren't there," I said, standing now. "You didn't visit. You didn't call. I was the one sitting with her when the medication made her forget where she was. You were busy flipping condos." My mother slammed her glass down. "How dare you accuse us?" I laughed then, a short, bitter sound. "You held a vote to erase me. Don't talk to me about ethics." No one spoke. I closed the folder and tucked it back into my coat. "I think we're done here," I said calmly. As I walked out, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. They thought they had cut me out of Grandma's legacy. What they didn't realize was that she had already chosen me. And this was only the beginning. I didn't go straight home after Christmas dinner. I drove. No destination. Just empty streets and glowing windows, houses full of people laughing, arguing, living lives that suddenly felt very far away from mine. I expected to feel shattered, angry, sobbing, hysterical. Instead, there was a strange calm, humming under my skin, the kind that comes after a long illness finally breaks. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, my phone was already lighting up. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. I ignored all of them. For once, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The next morning, the messages shifted in tone. Clara first. Can we talk? Then Julian's wife, all carefully chosen words about misunderstandings and family unity. By afternoon, Julian himself finally texted. You really think this is over? I didn't reply. 2 days later, my landlord called. Hey, Linda, he said hesitantly. Someone came by asking for your unit. Said they were handling your affairs. My stomach dropped. That night, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mother standing there holding a thick envelope. Her face was carefully neutral, the way she used to look when she was about to say something she'd already decided was right. She didn't knock again. She didn't need to. Against my better judgment, against every instinct screaming at me to protect myself, I opened the door. Linda, she said softly, stepping forward like she owned the space. We need to talk. I stayed in the doorway. About what? She lifted the envelope slightly. You left before we could explain. Emotions were high. Your brother was out of line. But families find solutions. The logo of a law firm peeked out from the corner of the envelope. This is just information, she added quickly when she saw my eyes drop. Options. Options. That word again. The family loved that word when they meant control. You want me to sign something, I said flatly. Her shoulders relaxed. We just think it's best if the house stays in the family. One person owning everything creates imbalance. You mean me owning it creates imbalance? She smiled, relieved. You'd still get a generous share. Very fair. I didn't respond. I simply began to close the door. Her foot shot forward, blocking it. Linda, she snapped, the softness gone. You don't have to make this difficult. I looked down at her shoe, then back up at her face. Move it. She hesitated just long enough for me to see the anger flash through her eyes, then stepped back. I shut the door and locked it. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from a cold, steady rage that had been building for years. That night I sat on the edge of my bed and let it all crash down on me. The favoritism, the gaslighting, the way I'd been treated like filler my entire life. Even Grandma's death hadn't slowed them down. They circled like vultures the second they thought there was something to take. I didn't sleep. The next morning, the emails started. At first, they were civil. Clara wanting peace. Julian's wife suggesting mediation. Then Julian stepped in and the gloves came off. His email was 3 paragraphs long and used the word deserved 6 times. This isn't about what Grandma wanted. It's about what the family deserves. He attached a proposal. Sell the estate back to the family at 70% of its value. A gesture of goodwill, he called it. I deleted it without replying. 2 days later, I was served. The petition was thick and cruelly formal: undue influence, lack of capacity, possible forgery. Suddenly, I wasn't the quiet daughter anymore. I was a manipulator, a villain, the woman who dared to step out of her assigned role. I sat on my couch papers spread across the coffee table and felt the weight of it press into my chest. They weren't just angry. They were coming for me. The first thing you learn when your own family sues you is how quickly the world shrinks. It starts with your inbox. Emails stacking up faster than you can open them. Legal language that feels deliberately designed to confuse and intimidate. Accusations dressed up as procedure. Every sentence ends with hereby, whereas pursuant to, as if using enough formal words, can turn a lie into truth. Then it seeps into everything else. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations from my childhood like they were evidence exhibits. Every joke that wasn't really a joke. Every time I'd been told to be patient, understanding, flexible. By the second week, my appetite disappeared. My clothes started hanging looser. My coworkers noticed I was quieter than usual on calls, my camera always off. When my manager gently asked if everything was okay, I said I was dealing with a family matter. That was the most neutral phrase I could find for my brother, is trying to erase me from existence. The legal fees piled up fast. I'd started with a budget attorney, someone recommended through a friend. He was competent, but cautious, too cautious. Every call ended with, "We'll see how it plays out." I didn't want to see how it played out. I wanted it to stop. But the worst part wasn't the paperwork. It was the doubt. Late at night, when the apartment was too quiet, I started second-guessing myself. Maybe Grandma hadn't been thinking clearly. Maybe I should have insisted she reconsider. Maybe accepting the estate really did make me selfish. I pulled the folder out again and again, rereading the signatures, checking the dates, like I was looking for proof that this was all a misunderstanding. And every time I heard her voice in my head, "You've been the only one who shows up. That matters." That was when I made the call. Her name was Elise Morgan, and she specialized in probate disputes. She wasn't cheap, and she didn't sugarcoat anything. On our first Zoom call, she listened without interrupting while I explained the history, the family dynamics, the lawsuit. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. So she said, "You're the scapegoat who finally inherited something." I blinked. I didn't. She held up a hand. "You don't need to explain. I've seen this pattern more times than I can count." "I don't want to destroy them," I said quickly. "I just want them to leave me alone." Elise raised an eyebrow. "That's rarely how these cases go. But okay, we'll play defense. And we'll play it well." Over the next few weeks, she dismantled their case piece by piece. Lack of capacity. Grandma had passed a cognitive assessment less than a month before signing the deed. Elise tracked down the neurologist and secured a written statement. Undue influence. Visitor logs from the senior center showed I was the only one who visited consistently. Not Julian, not Clara, not my parents. Forgery. The notary was still practicing and happy to confirm the signatures. Every time my family filed a motion, Elise responded with receipts. Still, the stress didn't vanish. Julian escalated emailing people I worked with on LinkedIn, implying I was under legal investigation. It didn't go anywhere, but the humiliation lingered. I stopped checking social media altogether. Some days I almost broke. Then something unexpected happened. I started remembering who I was before all of this. I forced myself into routines, small ones at first. Going to bed at the same time, cooking instead of ordering takeout, picking up my guitar untouched in the corner of the room since college. The first night I played, my fingers ached, but the sound grounded me in a way nothing else had. I also started therapy. It felt strange at first saying these things out loud, admitting how deeply the favoritism had shaped me, how I'd confused being liked with being loved. My therapist didn't rush to fix anything. She just listened. One day after I described the lawsuit and the guilt I still felt, she said, "You're not selfish. You're just finally allowing yourself to own something." That sentence lodged itself in my chest and refused to leave. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about surviving the lawsuit anymore. It was about reclaiming myself. Once I stopped reacting, I started noticing things. Patterns, mostly. How Julian only reached out when he wanted something. How my mother framed control as concern. How silence had always been my role. Stay quiet. Don't rock the boat. Let the louder voices decide what mattered. Therapy didn't change me overnight. It wasn't some cinematic breakthrough where everything suddenly made sense. It was slower than that, messier. A lot of uncomfortable pauses and realizations I didn't want to admit, like the fact that I had been trained to disappear. I started journaling. Not to vent, not to write a manifesto, just to record. Moments from childhood. Things I'd brushed off at the time. Birthdays overshadowed by Julian's achievements. Family decisions made without asking me, then presented as done deals. Seeing it all written out was unsettling. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. Christmas had just been the climax. By April, Elise told me the case was weakening. "They're running out of arguments," she said. "The judge isn't impressed. I think they expected you to fold." I almost laughed. They always expected that. Outside the courtroom, I started building something that had nothing to do with them. The idea had been sitting in the back of my mind since Grandma was still alive. She struggled with technology apps that assumed everyone had perfect eyesight, steady hands, endless patience. I remembered her frustration, the way she'd hand me her phone and say, "It's smarter than me again." What if it didn't have to be that way? I began sketching in the evenings. Interfaces designed for seniors, not adapted for them. Bigger text, clear pathways, no unnecessary clutter. I shared it with a couple of friends in tech, half expecting them to dismiss it. They didn't. Slowly, the idea grew. Late nights turned into prototypes. Prototypes turned into something real. I didn't tell my family. By then, communication had gone cold anyway. Clara sent a passive-aggressive email on Easter about forgiveness. I ignored it. My father never reached out at all. Julian updated his LinkedIn with a new title that meant nothing. It hurt less than I expected. I was too busy building. The lawsuit was still there looming, but it no longer defined every thought. I had something else to focus on. Something that felt honest. And for the first time, I wasn't doing it to prove anything to anyone. I was doing it because it mattered. By the time May arrived, the lawsuit felt like background noise. Still there, still real, but no longer the center of my world. What was consuming me was the project. I named it Eldra, short for Elder and Era, a bridge between where someone had been and where the world insisted they go next. It started as a design experiment, then quietly became a mission. I wasn't trying to disrupt an industry or chase headlines. I just wanted to make something that wouldn't make people like my grandmother feel stupid for needing help. Two friends from college joined me, developers who'd just burned out from a startup that cared more about growth charts than people. We met weekly over video calls, working nights and weekends, building slowly and carefully. No hype, no flashy promises, just intention. As Eldra took shape, something else shifted too. I started spending time at my grandmother's house again. Legally, it was already mine, but emotionally, I hadn't been ready. Walking up that familiar path for the first time alone felt strange, like stepping into a memory that hadn't decided whether to welcome me or push me away. The porch creaked the same way it always had. The rose bush she'd planted decades ago was still stubbornly alive. The neighbors remembered me. Mrs. Novak waved from across the street. The Halberts asked how I'd been. They didn't ask about the lawsuit. They didn't ask about the inheritance. They just said they were glad the house was still standing, still hers. That's when I learned what Julian had planned. He hadn't been quiet about it. Word traveled fast in that neighborhood. He and his wife had talked openly about tearing the place down, subdividing the lot, building 2 sleek townhouses that would modernize the block. Erase it. That was the moment the estate stopped feeling like property. It became responsibility. I called a local historian. He toured the house, studied the original blueprints, asked about my grandmother's involvement in neighborhood zoning meetings back in the 80s. When I showed him old letters she'd written to the city advocating for community preservation, his eyebrows lifted. "This qualifies," he said. "Historic designation, easily." I didn't hesitate. Let's do it. Within weeks, the application was submitted. If approved, the house couldn't be demolished, couldn't be stripped down and repackaged for profit. Julian had wanted leverage. I was building permanence. Around the same time, while digging through old files for documentation, I found drafts of something unexpected, a community grant idea my grandmother had sketched years ago. Notes about helping elderly homeowners repair ramps, roofs, railings, ways to keep people in their homes when developers came knocking. She never got to launch it, so I did. I established a small nonprofit using part of the estate's income and named it after her full initials. Quietly. No announcements. Flyers at the grocery store. A notice at the senior center. 3 people applied in the first month. I approved all of them. Each time a repair was completed, I added a small bronze plaque to the property, supported by the L.M. Holloway Trust. Julian had tried to turn her legacy into a business opportunity. I turned it into a living thing. By the end of June, Eldra had a working beta, a few hundred users, early interest. Nothing explosive, but solid, real. And for the first time since Christmas, I felt something close to peace. Not because I'd won, but because I was finally building something that couldn't be taken from me. The thing about quiet progress is that people don't notice it until it's too late to stop. By July, the historic preservation application was moving faster than expected. The city's review board flagged my grandmother's house as a strong candidate, its age, architectural integrity, and her documented involvement in community advocacy all worked in our favor. I didn't tell Julian. I didn't tell anyone in my family. There was no reason to. They'd forfeited the right to updates the moment they decided I was disposable. Meanwhile, the neighborhood changed the way it looked at me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, meaningful ways. Neighbors started stopping by when I was there, bringing iced tea, asking questions, sharing stories about my grandmother I'd never heard. About how she once organized a block-wide cleanup, how she loaned tools without expecting them back, how she knew which houses needed help before anyone asked. They remembered her, and now they saw me as her continuation. That mattered more than I expected. The nonprofit grew quietly. 6 homes by midsummer, ramps installed, railings repaired, one roof patched just enough to get a widower through the winter. Each project strengthened something deeper than property lines. It rebuilt trust in a community that had been waiting for someone to stand up for it. That's when I got the email. Subject line, zoning request notification. The name attached made my jaw tighten. Julian. He was trying again, this time a few streets over, technically outside the preservation zone. A duplex complex, high density, profitable, a fallback plan after losing the estate. I showed up to the neighborhood association meeting early, carrying a folder much thicker than the one I'd brought to Christmas dinner. Inside were studies, photos, testimonies, and letters of support. Evidence of what unchecked development had done to similar neighborhoods. Quotes from city officials praising preservation efforts. Stories from residents who'd already been displaced once. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't mention Julian's name. I'm not here to villainize anyone, I said evenly. But we need to ask who this neighborhood is for. The people who built their lives here, or the people who see it as a temporary investment. The vote wasn't close. The zoning request was denied. Julian's plan collapsed in a room full of folding chairs and fluorescent lights without shouting or drama. A week later, he emailed me. Let's talk. I think you'll want to see what I'm building. I agreed. We met at a neutral cafe downtown. No home turf, no audience. He walked in expecting a fight. I didn't give him one. I showed him Eldra, the trust, the preservation efforts, the growing network of neighbors and users. He stared at the screen longer than I thought he would. Finally, he looked up. Why are you showing me this? Because this was never about the house, I said quietly. It was about legacy, something you thought you were entitled to. He scoffed. So this is revenge. I stood slinging my bag over my shoulder. No, this is just the beginning. I left him there, confused, unsettled. For the first time in his life, Julian wasn't in control. And I wasn't finished. The story didn't explode overnight. It simmered. Eldra crossed 3,000 users quietly, the way meaningful things often do, through word of mouth, through caregivers, sharing links through seniors, telling other seniors, this one doesn't make me feel stupid. The L.M. Holloway Trust expanded to 2 more blocks. The Preservation Board fast-tracked my grandmother's house. Then a local reporter emailed me. She said she'd been following the preservation application and noticed the nonprofit grants. She asked if I'd be willing to talk about how it all started. I hesitated for exactly one night. Then I said yes. The article ran on a Tuesday morning. Granddaughter turns family feud into legacy. Tech platform for seniors. It opened with my grandmother, her 40 years in the neighborhood, her porch, her garden, the way she'd quietly supported people who never made the news. It mentioned that she left her estate to the granddaughter who showed up every week, not to the relatives who assumed. It didn't name Julian. It didn't need to. Neighbors were quoted, seniors who'd received grants, a city official praising the preservation effort, a line about a flashy relative with development plans that never materialized, slipped in gently like a scalpel. By noon, my inbox was chaos. Interview requests, accelerator invitations, impact investors asking for decks. Eldra was suddenly described as visionary, human-centered, timely. I took the calls because what came next required allies. That evening, my phone buzzed with a letter from Julian's new attorney. Cease and desist. Defamation. Emotional harm. Elise laughed when I forwarded it to her. They don't understand, she said. Truth doesn't need names. She drafted a response that was calm, precise, and devastating. Julian went silent again. But the damage to his image, his credibility, his sense of entitlement was done. I started receiving messages from strangers, caregivers, elderly women. One note stopped me cold. Your grandmother used to give me tomatoes every summer. I'm glad you're doing something with that kindness. I sat with that for a long time. I wasn't winning a fight anymore. I was carrying something forward. I'd avoided the hope chest for months. It sat in the attic of my grandmother's house, tucked beneath old quilts and yellowed photo albums, its metal clasp rusted shut. I told myself I wasn't ready, that opening it would be too much, that it would stir things I'd finally learned how to live with. The truth was simpler. I was afraid of finding nothing. One quiet afternoon in September, with the house filled, with that particular stillness, only old places know, I carried the chest downstairs and pried it open. Inside were decades of her life, letters from friends, recipes written in looping cursive, notes she'd taped to herself as reminders, and then beneath it all, a thick brown envelope with my name written across the front. Linda. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter wasn't legal. It wasn't dated or notarized. It was just her voice on paper. If you're reading this, then the house is yours. She wrote about my mother and Julian, how they'd always assumed things would be handed to them, how I never asked for anything, how I showed up when no one else did. Make me proud, sweetheart. I cried then, not quietly, not politely. I let it tear through me like a release valve finally giving way. When the tears stopped, I framed the letter. A week later, I held an open house. Not to sell, to honor. Neighbors filled the rooms. I displayed photos of my grandmother through the decades, her recipe stories people had shared with me. The letter sat in a glass case near the entryway. Reporters came, cameras flashed. And still, I never mentioned Julian. I didn't have to. After that, the fallout reached him fully. Investors pulled back. His social media went quiet. My sister emailed me a long message about family and forgiveness. I didn't respond, because this had never been about money. It was about character. I moved into my grandmother's house in October. Not all at once, not ceremoniously. Just one box at a time, room by room, learning the creaks of the floorboards, the way she had, opening windows in the morning, the way she always did. I renovated carefully, kept the bones intact, updated only what needed it. The soul of the place stayed exactly where it belonged. Eldra closed its first major investment round 2 weeks later. We hired 3 new team members, expanded our beta. The nonprofit trust extended into 2 more neighborhoods. Seniors started calling not just for help, but to ask how they could contribute volunteer share stories. Some evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sunset over the street where I used to visit every Sunday, the same street Julian once planned to erase. I think about that Christmas dinner, Julian standing up smug and certain, declaring I was no longer part of the family's future plans. He was right. I'm not part of their future. I built my own. They tried to erase me from the story, so I wrote a better one without them.